Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are. It's the start of Yale's spring semester here in New Haven, Connecticut, in the US. It's been really unseasonably cold here and throughout a lot of the US. I'm very happy to report that it's going to warm up. But the sun is streaming through my window, but I hope you can all see me. You're, of course, tuned in to the Yale Forest Forum's first webinar in our new series titled History of People, Forests, and Forestry. It's great to see many of you that have attended previous series, and a real special welcome to those that are new to the Yale Forest Forum. So far, we've gotten more than 2,000 people that have registered for this series, and they come from all over the globe. I know it's going to be a real fun 4 months and really educational, and I'm really looking forward to it. Happy to have you all here. So this series is co-hosted by the Forest School, the Yale School of the Environment, also co-hosted by the Forest History Society. My name is Gary Dunning, and I am the Executive Director of the Forest School and the Forest Dialogue, both based here in New Haven, Connecticut at the Yale School of the Environment. I'm one of your hosts for the series, and I'll be giving today's brief introduction for the webinar. Quickly, I want to share a bit more information on the Yale Forest Forum, or YFF, particularly for those that are unfamiliar. YFF was founded in 1994 by Yale professor John Gordon as a platform to bring together forest stakeholders in an effort to create a shared vision for the future of the forests in the US. YFF has evolved and grown over the past 30 years, but it's always remained focused on bringing people together and learning and sharing about forests. YFF is currently the special events hub for the Forest School here at Yale. It serves the Yale community and beyond as a forum for engagement, learning, and discussion on the most pressing topics and challenges related to forests today. This series is also part of a seminar course here at Yale. One of the anticipated outputs from the seminar will be blog posts about the topics covered during the webinars. These blogs will be written by our students and posted by the Forest History Society. So look out for those. They will be coming. To date, we've had 12 different YFF webinar series since we started in 2021. These series have covered many different forest-related topics. If you're interested in the past YFF series, check out the Yale Forest Forum reviews, like the one you see on your screen, and also presentation recordings that are all available and accessible on the Yale Forest Forum website. Now, I'm happy to introduce my co-host for this History of People, Forest, and Forestry series. First is Professor Mark Ashton. Mark is the Morris K. Jessup Professor of Silviculture and Forest Ecology and the Director of Yale Forests. You may not see a lot of Mark during the webinars, but rest assured he is very engaged on this topic. In fact, Mark is one of the co-authors or co-editors of an upcoming book on the history of Yale forestry. During the webinars, Mark will be primarily focused on curating all your amazing questions. Thanks, Mark, for helping us develop this series. Our other important and newest co-host is Dr. Tania Munz. Tania is the president and CEO of the Forest History Society based in Durham, North Carolina in the US. Tania and I will be trading off facilitation duties for the series, so you'll hear plenty from both of us. In fact, you'll hear more from Tania in a minute. So Tania, thank you and welcome. Now, a few words about the reason we've decided to produce this series. This year marks Yale Forest School's 125th anniversary. Throughout this year, we hope to share the story of the school and how it helped shape forestry and how forestry helped shape the school throughout the years. To tell that story, we felt it was important for the series to cover a deeper history of forests and people long before the establishment of the school in 1900. In fact, we want to explore some themes and focus on indigenous forestry and traditional forest practice that well precedes the advent of so-called scientific forestry about 150 years ago. So during this series, we'll hear from a variety of individuals that will share learnings about traditional forest practices and how those practices interacted and impacted those societies where they developed. This is certainly a new area for me, so I'm very excited for the next 4 months, and I know I will learn a huge amount. So very, very excited and hopeful for what we learn through the series. As you can see, we have a fantastic slate of themes and speakers lined up for you. Note that we still have a few slots that are open, so we'll be adding a few more additional speakers in the next week or so. So check back with the YFF website for the most up-to-date list. Finally, from me, a reminder for you all about series logistics. The series will convene on Thursdays from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern U.S. time through the end of April this year. The webinar presentations will run roughly 30 minutes or so with audience Q&A to follow. Please remember to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function. Each session in the series will be recorded and available on Yale Forest Forum's website shortly after the session. If you have any questions related to the series, please email us at yff@yale.edu. And all that information should be available through the chat. Now, I'm very happy to hand it over to my colleague and co-host, Tania Munz. Tania will lead today's discussion with our guest speaker, Péter Szabó. Tania, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Gary. And good afternoon, good morning, or wherever you may be joining us. I hope you are doing well, and we're delighted to have you here with us today. As Gary mentioned, my name is Tania Munz, and I'm the president of the Forest History Society. We're located in Durham, North Carolina. And for those of you who may not know us, I'm just going to say a few words about our organization to introduce you to the Forest History Society. So we are primarily a library and archive dedicated exclusively to forest and conservation history. Our mission, and we were founded almost 80 years ago, so in 1946, not quite as long as the Yale School of the Environment, but almost 80 years. And our mission has been to keep the documents that trace how humans have interacted with forests safe for the present and for the future. And that mission has really stayed very true over 80 years. But it's, of course, not enough to just keep documents safe and to keep that history safe. A big part of what we do and a core part of our mission is to really make that history accessible to researchers, scholars from all over the world, and also to the broader public. And some of the ways in which we do that is that we support research through fellowships and prizes. We also engage in nonpartisan education and outreach, like through this webinar. We have another webinar the Forest History Society does, and we do other various public programs. We do a publication program, and we are the proud co-publishers of Environmental History together with the American Society of Environmental History. If you want to find out more, we're at foresthistory.org. So I am delighted to be doing this series. FHS is delighted to be doing this series with the Yale Forest Forum. And I'm especially glad that so many of you have joined us today. Today's session is entitled Forest History, What Do We Know and How Do We Know It? And it's really intended, when Gary, Mark, and I were planning this series, we really thought about sort of doing that first session as kind of a framing to help us understand some of the questions that will be relevant in subsequent sessions as well. I'm especially interested in forest history when we don't have texts. And I think this is what our speaker is going to be talking about today as well. When we're trained as I'm trained as a historian of science, so my training was exclusively about texts. And I think this is where we get into really interesting territory when that's just not enough to tell the story of our forests and of our forest past. So we thought we would do a slightly different format from what you may be used to in the Yale Forest Forums, in that we thought it'd be really fun to do it as more of a dialogue between Péter Szabó and myself, and that way it can be interactive kind of from the get-go. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Péter Szabó. He is a senior researcher at the Institute of Botany of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and he is also a lecturer at the Faculty of Social Sciences of Masaryk University in Brno in the Czech Republic. He holds a PhD in medieval studies from the Central European University in Hungary, and he has master's degrees in history and English from ELTE University, also in Hungary. Before he moved to the Czech Republic in 2008, he also worked at an archaeological institute at ELTE. And his research really ranges from prehistoric forest dynamics through medieval woodland management to the study of the effects of great windstorms on forests in the past 2 centuries. So it's a huge span of time, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. He writes that he feels best in interdisciplinary research teams, and he was very pleased to lead such a team in the ERC-funded Longwood project. And he has also published extensively on the conceptual aspects of connecting ecology with history. Again, this is why we wanted to talk to him, exactly for those connections between the human sciences, the humanities, and the natural sciences. In 2017 to 2019, he was the president of the European Society for Environmental History, and in addition, he serves on the editorial boards of the journals Environment and History and Global Environment. So Péter, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
Great. So we have about, just for the people listening, we're going to talk, Péter and I are going to have a conversation for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then I'll turn it back over to Gary for your questions. So I'll start maybe a little bit with you and your research, Péter. And one of the things I was very struck by as I was doing research about your work and kind of the span of work that you've done is that you were trained as a medievalist, but your expertise and your work reaches far beyond that sort of textual medieval approach that we may be used to. And in one of your bios, you wrote, quote, "I study the historical connections between human societies and nature, and most of my research focuses on woodland. I try to cross the great divide between the humanities and the natural sciences in both my topics and my methods." And this is what we're excited in learning more about. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your work and how you got interested in this research and also in this approach that you have.
Well, maybe I'll start with my studies back in the university studies back in the 90s in Hungary, and think about a country fresh out of communism. And I studied history and English was okay, but history was a little bit problematic because we didn't really know what history was going to be after communism. But it was all what historians, well, most of it was what historians would call drum and trumpet history. So it was about kings and nations, and it was okay, but I was not really interested. I always had an affinity to nature, but there was nothing really to learn back then about these topics. Remember, even the European Society for Environmental History was established in 1999, actually it's in 2001 was the first conference, and in Hungary there was really nothing, or hardly anything, but there were a few courses, and I took them and it was like, yes, this is interesting. And then after I finished, I went to the Central European University, which is an American university. Back in the day it was in Budapest, now in Vienna, where there was an interdisciplinary medieval studies department, which I liked a lot. I was interested in the medieval studies and I liked it. There were archaeologists and art historians and all kinds of people there, so I thought this could be my place. My PhD supervisor was an archaeologist. And then it was there that I started to work on these topics, and I happened upon the works of Oliver Rackham. any of you in the audience know the name, is one of the most important figures, at least in European forest history and historical ecology. And he uses all these different kinds of methods, combines them in ingenious ways. And I thought, yes, this is something that, this is kind of the way I would like to do things. And then I worked, as you said, at an archaeology department, working on medieval topics. And then in 2008, and this is all just an accident, life is full of accidents, I suppose. In 2008, I met a botanist who had a similar way of thinking as me. And we wrote a project together, and then I moved to the Czech Republic. And then I started working as a historian, as a medieval historian originally, at the institute, at the Department of Vegetation Ecology. And I've been there ever since. Now I also teach at the local university. So this is kind of my story. Basically, my interest sort of pushed me one way, and that it's unconventional. There aren't too many historians at the Institute of Botany, but this is basically the story of my life in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit about a forest that you've actually spent a fair amount of time studying, and that's the Divine Forest in the Czech Republic. What's striking to me is that you are able to speak about this forest and how it's changed, how the management has changed or not changed over 7 centuries, which is really remarkable. And I'm wondering if you could kind of take us to the beginning of the period that you look at, so maybe the 1300s or so, and tell us a little bit about what this forest was like and also how it was being managed.
Right, yes, this is the place that I probably know best of all forests. Now you have to imagine this is a lowland landscape, relatively warm, in a part of the country where there have always been lots of people since the Neolithic, dense settlement. And this place is, by any standard, is very well documented.
Can I just hop in real quick?
Yes.
I just got a text. If you could just speak a little bit more slowly, because we're getting a little bit of static on the audio, I think people will be able to understand you a little better.
So, where was I? Yes, so this is a forest that by any standards is quite well documented. This is a specialty, not an exclusive specialty of Europe. There are other continents where there are good documents going back, 500, 600, 700 years. But this place is one of those. This forest is one of those places. And is very well documented. So the first good documents that we have, the first one is actually from 1384. It's a description of the forest, and it's a very workaday document, and all the documents I use are pretty workaday. So what you see in this document is that they were walking through the entire estate, not just this forest, lots of little forests, and you can see from this document that this whole landscape looks basically like today, lots of agriculture and little forest. So they walked through this landscape, visited every single forest, there were, 20, 30, 50, and had made a description. And the description consisted of telling where the forest is, what it is called, how old the stand was at that point, and then they give you the rotation cycle, when they will cut it. And it's basically always the same. It's a surprisingly low number. Usually they say something like, this forest was 2 years old, and when it becomes 7 years old, we will cut it and sell it for this and that much money. Sometimes, when the forest is older, they would say, yeah, we'll have a problem selling this place because it's too old. It's full of big trees, so this is going to be difficult. This is an economic document. They were interested in the revenues. So what this means, actually, this is, once again, it's not exactly a European specialty. It exists on other continents as well. This management system is called coppicing. And I'm sure lots of people in the audience will know what coppicing is. I will describe it very briefly. It's a system where you cut broadleaf trees repeatedly, and they always grow back. And then you cut them again and they grow back, you cut them again. What you get is a coppice tool, is a big trunk, kind of low trunk that just keeps growing and growing. The point in the system is the production of firewood. So you get small trees that are easy to cut, easy to transport, and good for firewood. So this is the system they were having here already in the 14th century. You can see this very clearly. From this document, we can also see, as I said, that the landscape looked basically like it does today.
Amazing. And just, I think there was also a question about the forest that we're talking about. It's called Devin, spelled D. I mean, you can pronounce it better, Peter, than I can, but it's spelled Devin wood.
Yes.
The name of the forest. Amazing. So that you explained the coppicing system that's been fairly consistent in these woods. There's been some changes, but truly that's been sort of the predominant method of management over the centuries. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the ways in which the management of this plot has changed, and also maybe some of the socioeconomic reasons for why you've seen the changes over these many centuries that you've looked at?
Yes, well, the main characteristic of the whole place is stability as far as management is concerned. Really, what you can see in the 14th century, we have no idea. When you see it for the first time in the 14th century, the management looks to be completely established. We have no idea how long this was going on. I wouldn't be surprised if it went back to the Bronze Age. And this management goes on until the first half of the 20th century. And this, you might assume that this goes together with some sort of an economic or social stability that is behind the management, but that's not quite the case, it seems. There were quite a few changes, but basically the backbone of the whole system is that people need firewood. Okay, you live in a world where this is, in this place at least, is the only source of energy basically you have, other than water. So they needed firewood, basically to survive. Then the motivations of the estate management can differ, and the ways they approach this whole issue can differ. As we saw in the 14th century, the system is very money-based. Yes, this document that I was talking about also gives us lots of details about how much money they made from these forests in the 14th century, and also what it means in the estate economy. That's a larger area where the forest belongs, and we can see this is about 1/4 of all the incomes of the estate come from these forests. So there's a very strong economic incentive from the side of the estate management to keep the system running. They make good money. But they sell the firewood to the peasants. A few hundred years later, when we see it again, the management is still the same, but they're not making any money. We're already in the 16th, 17th century, where wood is no longer an interesting commodity as far as money, income is concerned. You will have fish ponds if you want to make money, or you will have your brewery or something like that. So they get rid of this, but they still know, the estate managers, people need firewood. If you don't get them firewood one way or another, they will be unhappy, and you don't want that. So what they do is they lease out the forest for very little money, and then the peasants manage it and sort of deal with it themselves. There's still a little money coming from the forest, but they're no longer interested. Now this system goes on until basically the 20th century. And once again, from the 19th century, they're selling more, and they write about this. They say, yeah, well, we can sell as much wood as we want. It's really not a problem. They say this at the beginning of the 20th century still. But then, of course, coal comes in. Railways come in, and the whole energy system changes, and that's the biggest change ever. Here is firewood is no longer a product that would interest people, and then the whole system falls to pieces. People use something else for heating, cooking, energy, and no one needs the firewood anymore. So what they do is first they just leave. They just let the place be. This is typical for very many places in Europe. The managers just leave, and nothing happens for a while, and then nature conservation comes in, and they say, oh, this is actually, it's a nice place, so they turn this into a nature reserve, strict protection. You cannot do anything. Before that, there was a little planting of pines, and for forestry, modern scientific forestry, this is not an interesting place. It's too small, it's too rocky, it's just not interesting. So this is what happens in the 20th century, yes. Other than this, the only interesting change, and that's a European phenomenon, is that the cycle, the cutting cycle, the coppice cycle prolongs from the medieval 7 years up unto 20, 30, 40 years in the 20th century. It's one of the big mysteries in European forest history, because it happens everywhere. everywhere. And we don't really know why. We all have guesses, but no one has really looked at this. We just follow this everywhere from Hungary, Czech Republic, Germany, England, everywhere. We don't really know why this is happening. If anybody has an idea out there in the audience, I'll be happy to hear it.
Right. One other change that I'm wondering about, and so the very compelling consistency is around this coppice forest. The other piece, though, that people, or the other wood need that people have, of course, is for construction. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about timber and about the standards in this plot as well. Is that a factor at all?
Yes, it is a factor, but if you count overall consumption, firewood is much more important. That's a product you need continuously, whereas a well-built house can last centuries. There were fires, there were occasions when they needed it, and then they combined the coppice tools with the standard trees. They did some calculations about how many standard trees, and there are regulations in the Middle Ages, early modern period, where they say you have to leave, I don't know how many standard trees, 30 per hectare or something like this. We also counted them on aerial photographs in the first half of the 20th century. What is visible from all of this is this was the standard trees that was not a regular product. So sometimes you had more, sometimes you had less. If there was a big fire sweeping through the estate, then they needed to build lots of houses, then they were gone. I think they looked at it more or less like a bank deposit. So you just had some and then you used it when you needed it.
Great analogy. And this actually, you talked just now at the end, you talked a little bit about aerial photographs, and that actually is a perfect segue into my next question. And that is about the sources that you use. You talked a little bit about those, you call them workaday sources, where it's just people going through the woods and taking inventory for an estate, doing that kind of management where you glean kind of what the forest composition and management was like. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the kinds of sources that you use in your work, and maybe also how those sources change over the time span that you're looking at. So this is really asking us to think about how do we know what we know about this particular wood.
Yes, I learned this, among many other things, from Oliver Recken, who said texts are wonderful, documents are wonderful things, but they don't tell the whole story. And I do believe that's true. Partly because you don't get, documents will be missing, That's the nature of written documents, A. And B, there are lots of things that they simply never wrote about because for the purposes of those documents, they were not important. So there are whole issues that never get into the documentary sources. So yes, as you said, the written sources I usually work with workaday documents, account books and descriptions and all that. And I spent
I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now? Oh, yes.
I can hear you now. And you made the very good point that a lot of things is not captured in written sources.
So I spent a lot of time working with...
Pick up on that and...
Oh, I don't know. I hope you can hear me now.
I can hear you now. Yep, go ahead.
So I spent a lot of time working with ecologists who are working with, for example, with pollen analysis, or charcoal, micro-charcoal, macro-charcoal, macro remains, which is like smaller parts of plants that are visible through a microscope. And for example, and that's a good example, I think we did some research on that, charcoal is important because fire is a powerful management tool in forests. A management tool plus forest fires do happen as well. We sadly see them now in the US. And if you use it, if it's a big fire that happens by accident, you would probably get a document about it. But if it's fire used to manage the forests, you never get a document unless it gets out of hand. Because, that's my experience at least, this is not something that had economic relevance or something like they just wouldn't write about it. So you actually get a whole sort of a whole method of managing, for example, a forest that will never get into the written sources because simply it is not relevant for those sources unless it gets out of hand. Then it does. Another source that we use, because I work at the Department of Vegetation Ecology, is current vegetation. Because what grows there today in these forests is, of course, partly the result of the natural conditions there, but it's partly the result of management, and that not only trees, which are obviously influenced by people, but also the herb layer. And the last thing, well, not the last thing, one more thing that we work a lot with is the landscape itself, landscape features, and some of these are connected directly to forest management, and we use a lot of LiDAR data. LiDAR is a technology. Light detection and ranging is a technology that basically can make a very nice computerized image of anything that's on the ground. And for forest history, this was extremely important because, once you're in the forest, you can see things, but from an airplane, you see nothing. You just see the trees, the canopies. And for decades, we thought, well, this is how it is. We just don't see through the trees. But that changed with the introduction of LiDAR, and now what we can see, you can see through the canopy and see the ground. So there was a lot of research. I was involved in some of this, with discovering Roman fields in forests that were supposed to be forever forested, mapping features that are connected to forest management, banks and ditches and all this. This is a wonderful tool that we try to use.
Yeah, those images are amazing. The level of detail that you can see are pretty incredible. That sounds amazing. I mean, I think you're incredibly collaborative, again, sort of for a medievalist especially, the fact that you work with experts in so many different disciplines, I think is very exciting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you were talking obviously about the opportunities of those kinds of collaborations, is that we get a much more complete picture of how forests have been through time and also today. But I wonder if you could also speak to maybe some of the challenges of collaborating across these disciplines.
I think, well, those challenges are, I think, two kinds. One of them is kind of institutional, and the other kind is scientific. The institutional challenge, I don't know about all the regions of the world where I work. Interdisciplinarity, this kind of collaboration, is encouraged, by so many words. But when it gets to, institutional structures, funding, grant schemes, it is very difficult to get funding for such a project. It's much easier just to do your own thing. I don't believe that's the right way, for example, in this way, but this is something that you really need to work on. If you want to do interdisciplinary research, you really need to find the ways to get funding, to work together with other institutions. Not at all easy. The other challenge, the scientific challenge, of course, is that, you have to find, first you have to find a meaningful question. And I worked a lot together with people who are very far from me, as far as their education is concerned. So what I thought was useful always is to sit together and try to find a question that is meaningful for everybody. Because we are talking about the same places, a forest, for example, but our questions can be radically different. And the possible answers we can give can be radically different. So you need to sort of think together before you start doing anything. And a lot of this has to do with scale and resolution, I think. Scale, what kind of, are you looking at a huge area, a small area? Because, I don't know, biogeography, they just look at something big. Historians hate this, they just want to look at one particular place. Vegetation ecologists are happy with this, but they want the kind of detail that historical documents cannot provide. So, this is a difficult process. And, on a more theoretical level, they say, I also like to say this, a synergy is great. If you put two things together, the results can be more than the sum total of the individual results. But I'm afraid it works the other way as well. So if you get it wrong, you get both things wrong, or three things, it just multiplies, the end result is going to be 4 times worse. So you need to keep this in mind, and we all make mistakes. And that's, yes, it's good to keep in mind, yes, as I say. The result is not necessarily better.
Yeah. And I imagine takes real care, and like you said, it took a long time to find a meaningful question and to kind of co-develop that. Like it sounds worth doing when it's done well, but also that it has its challenges. And I think when people are trained, they're trained very deeply in their cultures and in their disciplinary cultures. I wanted to ask you another question, and that is sort of, what motivates this whole series. We're not, and this is also, I think, the perspective of the Forest History Society, is that we love history and we enjoy history for its own sake, of course, but we also hope that there's lessons to be gleaned from history, and we hope that we can make better decisions in the present and be better stewards of our future by understanding our history. So I would love to hear from you about what your hopes are for your work for the present, kind of why history matters, you think, for us now, given your work. And the other thing, I'll just say this as a quick aside, I have been asked for us to define, just to give another explanation. You talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but if you could also just redefine what coppicing means real quick, because our audience is really broad and bring really different backgrounds and areas of expertise. So a quick definition of coppicing and the coppice system, and then if you can talk a little bit about your work and its impact on today.
Okay. So coppicing is a way of firewood production. It is a specific way of cutting broadleaf trees and then letting them grow from the stumps, basically. The result after 5 years is going to look like a bush or something. After 10 years, you will cut it again and it will grow again. It's vegetative reproduction. That's the system. The idea behind the system is that you need firewood, but you have very limited energy to invest into the process, or you don't want to invest more energy into the process than you necessarily have to. You live in a society where any extra work that you do not have to do is unwelcome. So what you do not want to have is a big tree that you need to chop up into small pieces. Yes, and that's why coppicing works. You get little trees, thin little trees, and then you cut them, wait for 10 years, cut them again, and the process, because it's vegetative, can go on forever, basically. Biologically, you push the tree back into a younger stage, and really, the oldest coppice tools, as we call them, are many hundreds of years old, possibly thousands of years old. Yes. And about the meaning of history. Well, you see, I was trained as a historian, and it's very unusual for a historian to feel extremely useful. We know we are useful, of course, but in a sort of direct way. So this is one of the things I really love most about my work. The example. Let's go back to this forest that we visited at the beginning, Jevin. So this is a protected area. It's actually just below national park level, which means that there's zero management. They must not do anything. Well, they do sometimes, but there's no management. The result is, and we did studies about this, is for the past 100 years, the forest is growing older and darker. Which it doesn't sound too bad, doesn't it? I mean, there's lots of dead wood and all these things, but at the same time, the nature protection people, organization that is responsible for this place, they are seeing processes that they do not like. Plants that are protected there, the most special, the most interesting, they're disappearing. They're dying out. And they thought for a while, well, maybe, it just needs time to recover. But this was going on continuously. And there came the point when they said it's too much. We're doing something wrong. Okay, it looks nice, the place, but actually the purpose of protection, nature protection here, is dying out. So we need to do something. And what they said, one of the things they did, they came to us and said, okay, maybe we know there's history here of management. So maybe it is connected, all these negative things that we're seeing, maybe they're connected to the fact that there's no longer management. And most probably it is true. This is not, again, a local specialty. We've seen it in many places in Europe. The specialty of this place is light, has always been light. So the protected, the most interesting plants there are light demanding. You take away the light, they die out. Makes sense. So they said, okay, let's say this is one of the reasons, not the only one, of course, it's complicated, but it's among the reasons. So what we need to do is reintroduce traditional management into this place, or we can try this. And we said, of course, we're very happy, and then we had a discussion, how to do this, where to do this, how was this done earlier, what, sort of, this is one thing we did. And the other thing is, of course, once they started cutting, people disliked it. It's a very touristy place. People are used to a certain way the forest looked. When they saw they're cutting this, and it's a nature reserve, you shouldn't. They were writing letters and asking why this is happening. And then we also have explaining this to people. They are bored, saying this is happening because of traditions, because it's good for nature protection here. This is how it worked in the past. This is your tradition. This is your heritage, cultural heritage as well. This is the other thing we did. So I'm quite happy about that. And my botanist friends colleagues are, of course, monitoring the results of reintroduction. So far, it looks good.
Fantastic. I love it. Okay. That is a great place, I think, for us to stop and open it up for Q&A. Peter, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm going to hand it over to Gary, and Gary is going to manage the Q&A.
Thanks, Tania, and thanks, Peter. It's been a great discussion. Really awesome. We have a bunch of questions that have come in, so let's see what we can get through in the time that we have remaining, about 18 minutes. Peter, can you talk more about Oliver Rackham's work at Cambridge? Why was he so formative in historical ecology of ancient woodlands?
Oh, wow. Thank you. It's probably my favorite question. Well, he started in the 1960s from plant physiology, basically, studying light, and he went over to historical ecology. His historical ecology has at least two forms, but in this kind of ecological, historical ecology, he's the founding father. He was the first one to say, okay, all these things that actually I also said. Management is extremely important. Coppice woods are cultural heritage. If you abandon management, you will see changes in nature that you will most probably, as nature conservationist, dislike. If you reintroduce management, you will see positive changes. And also, he was the one. Well, he did it all himself. He was that kind of. He was a Renaissance man, but he was a botanist. He was a really good historian. He could read medieval documents in Latin and all these things, and he could combine these things together. And he wrote very popular books, very, very, very well written, which started the whole kind of process. In one way or another, I'm also part of this process. But there are lots of people in Europe, also all over the world, who were inspired by his work.
Okay. Thanks for that. Robin asks, are there any books that either of you recommend? So Tania, you as well. Are there any books that either of you recommend for folks who want to read more about forest history or historical ecology? I imagine there's a lot. What maybe would be a top one that you'd like to share with this audience? And Tania, please jump in if you can, if you want.
Because there are so many, I agree. I mean, one thing is I would recommend that you go to the Forest History Society webpage, and we have really robust research portals where you can search by topics and also by authors, and it is specifically around forest and conservation history. So that would be a good place to to start, but Peter may have specific one top book that he would recommend.
I'm sorry to go back to recommend, but it's just the one book that I would recommend. It would be his Trees and Woodland in the British Landscape, which is an old book at this point, written in 1967, or 76, I'm sorry. But it's the best introduction to the whole topic.
Sorry, the author name again? Sorry, just to reiterate.
Yeah, sorry. Oliver Rackham, the one we were talking about.
Oliver Rackham. Okay, sorry.
I won't mention his name again, but if it's just the one book, I think it's this, because it's popularly written, it's understandable, and it's the best introduction.
All right, sounds good. See, next question. Jade asks, I'm curious, are there non-written sources that give cultural context to forestry, i.e. examples such as songs or carvings?
Lots, of course. There's a whole research direction that deals with the cultural aspects of forest history, of course. I can recommend, for example, Charles Watkins' book. So it's an English author. There's a recent, I cannot recall the title, but it's a recent book about the cultural history of forests.
Is that Charles?
Charles Watkins.
Charles Watkins. Okay, thank you. James asked, did I hear correctly that coppicing intervals have extended from every 7 years in the medieval times to every 30, 40 years in the 20th century? Yes, and as I said, that's everywhere in Europe, and if anyone can explain why, I'll be very happy. Right. I'm sure somebody has some ideas out there, so please share. Yanni asks, what was the issue or practice that you said, we don't know why it happens in Europe, and he would love to hear any suggestions? That's the one yes, that's the one, the coppice one? Okay. The coppice cycle, yes. Great. No one ever writes why, of course. This is a non-topic. They just say this is how long it takes, but they never say why. Rachel asks, were the peasants the ones using fire management as a tool, or was this before the management was in the hands of the peasants who were leasing the land? I'm not quite sure I understand it. For a very, very, very long time, until the 19th century, at least in Europe, management is directed, shall we say, by a few people, forest managers, but the actual work is done by the peasants. Okay. So if somebody from a peasant community thought to themselves, I think we need to use fire, they would most likely need permission to do that, right? They couldn't or wouldn't have just done it. Closely regulated system, either on a manorial level, so the forester actually tells you go there, cut this, or it's on a community level, the community organizes, but it's always very closely monitored because the resource is finite. Okay, there's basically never enough. Right. Okay. Hallie asks, please tell us more about the impact of Roman colonization. I'm sure there's a lot you could share, but maybe a few key issues. Well, on forests, that's a big question. Yes. Romans were actually, not that we know so much, but some aspects stand out. Either the Romans already knew about coppicing, they described it, so they probably used it, and one of the largest factors, as far as we can imagine, in the introduction of conscious forest management is larger concentrations of people, towns, in other words. And the Romans, of course, were not the first ones, but in Europe at least, they were the ones to produce huge towns. And if you think about the metabolism of a town, it requires all sorts of resources, including firewood and building timber. And so this was probably a huge effect of Roman colonization in various parts of Europe, that all of a sudden forest management had to be organized in order to provide resources, wood, to all those towns that were fairly large, comparable to towns today. Okay, interesting. Mitch asks, you mentioned revenue as the driving management objective in the 14th century. Was management also influenced by important cultural values, religious, ceremonial, or recognition of effects on wildlife populations that were important sources of sustenance?
I'm not sure about cultural values. I think it is relevant. This is just something I don't really do. So I'm not the right person probably to answer that question. It would be difficult to connect management with cultural values though. But the other question, the wildlife populations, that's very relevant. That's already Roman times and certainly in the Middle Ages, even more in the early modern period. Especially in places that were not so, that were more forested. Hunting is a major issue. Lots of protection of forests is happening because of hunting to maintain wildlife populations that are attractive enough. And actually that management is also directed by these needs. So it's among the most important factors actually outside, everyday needs and economic reasons. It's among the most important factors that sort of drive how people relate to forests.
Okay. There was as Tania mentioned, a lot of the comments or questions that we received related to coppicing, different aspects of coppicing. Here's another coppicing related question from Rachel. How widespread was coppicing as a practice for harvesting firewood? I'm curious why that practice wasn't really brought over to the colonies in North America if it was a known efficient method of harvesting firewood. Was it because the colonists also had so much building to do? Before you answer though, Peter, I just want to mention to Rachel and the others, there is in the fall of this year, we will have another YFF series that's looking at what's called scientific forestry, about the 150 past years of forestry up to modern times. So we will definitely cover this issue in the fall. But Peter, what do you want to mention about that now? Why was coppicing, if you know, not so popular in North America for firewood?
First part of the question is how much coppicing was going on in Europe. Difficult question, because to be able to truly answer that, you need to have information about very, very, very many places. We don't have that. I've done a study about my place, which is about 27,000 square kilometers, and what we found there in the Middle Ages is basically everything is coppiced. That is broad-leaved. That's our idea. There is a study for Europe which is based on consumption. So you sort of assess how many people lived in Europe in various parts in 1600. And if they all needed firewood and that was produced by coppicing, then you get some sort of an idea of how much coppicing was going on. A huge amount. That was the conclusion of that study. That's where we are at the moment. And why was not taken over to the colonies, that's a very good question. I was also wondering myself. It's a very efficient production method, as you say. My only guess is that there were not quite enough people, especially at the beginning, to be interested in this. There was just a lot of wood around, so you didn't need to bother. But maybe this is an insufficient answer. And by the time there are enough people to sort of think about, trees as a definitely finite resource, you already have other methods. You already have modern forestry. But this is just basically just an idea. I don't really have any hard evidence for this.
Okay, thanks though for sharing that. This is more of a comment, but maybe you have a comment. Interesting to note. Diane suggests that a fantastic book is Forest, The Shadow of Civilization by Richard Pogue Harrison. Diane states, I learned so much from that to inform my work in the Congo. Are you familiar with that work or have any comment about that?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great. Everybody should get it. Awesome. Okay. Lace asks, any thoughts about past coppicing in southern Africa? Any information or knowledge on that?
I don't have any information. That would be lovely. I'm always interested in various places in the world. The best known example is Japan. There's a lot of work on Japanese coppicing.
Okay. And somebody has just, or not somebody, Yale Forest Forum has just posted that in the chat so people can see it. I want to note that I think this is from Professor Ashton, who commented to me, FYI, coppicing was very much part of Eastern North America in rural colonization and during the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, okay. I think that's from Mark. It might be from Tania, but thank you.
Thank you. So now I know. Now I know. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I'm learning as well. Let's see. I think maybe we have time for one more at most. Another coppice one. Is it? Wait, let me see. This is also from Mark, and I think this will wrap it up for us. Check out this book from North America, for North America. The book's title is From Coastal Wilderness to Fruited Plain by Gordon Whitney. I think with that, I think we're going to wrap it up, Peter. I have a couple things to say as we wrap up this particular session. Peter, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, telling your story. Lots of comments about people appreciating your time. So thanks, Peter, and obviously thanks to Tania for facilitating that conversation. I'm going to share a little bit more information about next week. But apologies up front for anybody who asked questions we weren't able to get to. Part of our challenge, of course, is we receive a lot of questions. We would be happy to share the questions with Peter, and so he might be able to answer some of those more directly and get back to you all if we have your contacts, which we do for many. So as a reminder, recordings of today's discussion will be available within several days on the Forest Forum website. Just to note for you that may not know, there's a several day delay in us being able to post the recording because we need to accurately and professionally caption the entire session. So we send that out to a captioning service. That makes the recordings much more accessible to a wider range of folks. So it takes a day or two to do that, but if you want to view or share the recording with somebody, just check back in a couple days. In the future, there were no slides today, but in the future, the slides, if shown, will be available on the website as well. As well, Peter shared a few readings with us. We will endeavor to put the references of those readings on the website below Peter's biography. So again, check back for that for the readings that Peter has shared with us. Next week, please join us again on Thursday next week from 12 to 1. And again, every Thursday from 12 to 1 this spring. Next week, we're going to hear from Marcus Colchester. Marcus is an anthropologist with the Forest Peoples Program based in the UK. Marcus is going to share his presentation on forests, law, and people's rights, snapshots from a history of forestry. And I believe Marcus is going to share his work not only in Europe, but also in Latin America and from Southeast Asia. So lots of examples related to law and people's rights in forests. So stay tuned for next week.